The Iran-U.S.-Israel crisis, which escalated after U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran in late February 2026, has sent shockwaves through global energy markets, disrupting oil and gas flows through the Strait of Hormuz and forcing key Gulf producers to curtail production. Against this volatile backdrop, energy expert Glenn Labhart examines the effects on global supply chains. Rising fuel prices, strained fertilizer supplies, and deferred refinery maintenance, and explores whether the U.S. is shifting toward a merchant role in controlling global energy flows. He also warns that AI-driven data center power demands are placing a growing strain on electricity grids, that Cyprus and other isolated grids remain particularly vulnerable, and that if Gulf production were shut down today, it could take 3 to 6 months or more to recover.
Just from a technical point of view, Glenn, I mean, obviously we're seeing the price of crude going up. How does that translate practically into, the price of goods and services and whatever? I mean, is it a proportionate or proportional increase, or is certain industries more prone to are more sensitive to the changes? Just give us an idea a little bit, because we've got to relate it to the everyday effects, because then my other questions will make sense. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would answer it this way. I mean, to be specific, the Iranian conflict and other global matters have raised the price of oil. There's no question. Translating that to what's the effect on the consumer, you've got a very wide gap there, and I'll answer this that way. When you look at the energy business is based on production, then it's based on supply and distribution and storage and transportation, and then it gets to retail. So it's got to go through a lot of series of steps before it gets there. And so I think that as I have approached this for a lot of my clients, it's been a matter of do we need to look at the supply chain management with regards to what's available to be processed to someone into the retail sector? And in the retail sector, which is really your final sector of delivery, that's going to vary by geographic location from Europe to US to states within the US and so forth. There'll be different pricing mechanisms, but it's definitely affecting it because you're affecting that whole supply chain management. The possibilities of translation of economics infinitely from production to retail are substantial, because every market is different in the world right now. To give you an example, here in the States, we've got average $4, maybe $4 plus on gasoline at the pump. In California, it's getting close to $6 or $7. In Texas, we are approaching $4.50 to almost $5 a gallon for gasoline for unleaded. But then your diesel costs are off the map. So you've just got a lot of regional variations. But I would say that the production increase is definitely flowing through. It's just very regional and on a global basis.
Would you say, because a lot is made from the fact out of the fact that the U.S. is self-sufficient in energy, and yet U.S. Retail of oil is going up. One would expect that you would be insulated as a country against the hikes, because after all, we're just talking about Kuwaiti and Saudi oil and whatever, and it's not really going to the United States. So, or is it? I mean, it's supposedly going to China and going to elsewhere, or to Europe. You are exporting a lot to Europe, but I guess mostly gas, though, right? It's not. You would have expected that the U.S. would be making a real hefty profit on this now, prices go up, good, you're a net exporter. So, but I guess it doesn't work that way, or does it? Or if
No, it goes back to what I said a moment ago. You've got certain relocation or geographical differences. Right now in the States is supplying out of the Gulf Coast a lot of refined products to Europe. That's where you're getting a lot of your gasoline from. Because if you're not getting any oil in the Middle East going into your Rotterdam market and pushing it further, or anything in the region that you're in the Mediterranean, you got a problem. So therefore, someone has to go towards inventory. The reason that we are a big supplier is we have a lot of inventory. But when that inventory goes down relative to production within the Persian Gulf or the Straits of Hormuz, and you can't get it out, you have to start drawing products. Let me comment for you as well, the self-sufficiency of the United States. I would argue that it's not as self-sufficient as everybody wanted. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having communication within the news of why we need to drop our sales or gas tax on some of the states, because that's part of our problem. It doesn't make much sense to say in a free market environment you're going to drop a tax and there's nothing wrong in the Persian Gulf. So the politics of it all, lack of a better word, I think really kind of translates to you have a supply problem globally on a regional basis all over the world, and it is impacting the inventories.
and it's affecting obviously the derivatives. I mean the fertilizers and all the rest of the stuff. Again, how is the U.S. standing? And then I'll ask you to do a similar, so give us a similar little note on Europe and how they're faring. But it seems that part of the expected economic troubles down the road is also because of the lack of fertilizer and all the other stuff that's coming out of the energy, the hydrocarbon industry, let's say.
Right. I mean, to clarify that, when you go through the refining processing of crude oil, you're going to get different streams. They go on and they then get reprocessed. So the fertilizer that you're referring to is coming out of the petrochemical stream. And so some of the reports from a recent conference that I chaired here in Houston indicated that anywhere from 40 to 50% of the supply has been impaired on fertilizer, which is critical because the nature of a lot of the sourcing of that supply being that it's there in the region in the Straits of Hormuz, or it is in other areas of main refining areas of petrochemicals, you have a limited supply. Once again, you've got to draw your inventories down, and there's not enough to get to a lot of the farmers. And that transit time, I think, is what's critical to note. You've got 60 to 90 days to be able, or well, 30 days to get it there and 60 to 90 days to process it, get it into the hands of someone who needs it for actual consumption in farming or otherwise. So that's a very good point and a very critical point, I think, right now, because it affects more, and it will be affecting more of the global commodity sector for the soft goods and things like that on the grain side. So this is a real problem.
And prior to 22, I guess a lot of these fertilizers and the urea and the rest of it came out of Ukraine and Russia, right? At least
That's
for,
correct.
yeah, and so that's been, is that completely cut off, or what is have there been relaxations on the sanctions against Russian stuff?
I would say that a lot of the sanctions against Russia have been relaxed to a large degree. I don't know that I can speak intelligently and specifically to the final distribution of where a lot of their fertilizer are going. I mean, they have a war going on. I don't know that I have the window into Putin's desk to identify such specifics. I would say that from a macro sense, the information that I can share is that most of the inventories are going to be affected in anywhere from 30 to 60%. So they're telling people to watch your fixed and variable costs. I think you're going to probably, that translates into labor. that translates to layoffs, that translates to a lot of things in the global economic scale when you have that kind of reduction and you're not able to facilitate a planning cycle for planting into your second and third quarters when you reap a lot of your harvest. It's going to be a problem. So it's a big
Would you say
problem.
that there is, however, all things, beyond what we've mentioned, is there an upside to this thing for the United States? I mean, from what's happening, this constraint in the exports from the Gulf, is it long-term, strategically, geopolitically, is it benefiting the United States or not?
I would say this: you're going into new territory right now by having the United States taken over Venezuela, by having this area of the world in the Persian Gulf be closely guarded, lack of a better word. I think the longer term is it gives the U.S. probably a competitive advantage to perhaps, and I don't know this, this is my own personal opinion, the actions taken kind of point towards the U.S. taking a more great, as a government, taking more of a growing merchant role in the energy business versus supporting the multinational oil corporations who have a large tax base, a large capital base, and forever there. And I think the best way to say that is, the initial meeting out of Venezuela, the chairman of Exxon said it was uninvestable. I don't know that that means other than you've had actions taken that have not got refined economics. And so I think it's fair to point out that multinational companies are running on a 10-year capital cycle to develop reserves, to look for them, to find them, to develop them, to process them, and so forth. So it's a big machine. And even as many people participate in the silos, how that applies to the U.S. Is frankly for me a little bit of a wild card because I've never seen a merchant role by the United States. We've always held inventories as a strategic reserve. People are pulling down our strategic reserve. There's been recommendations that have been made to other nations in the world to do the same thing. But you now have the U.S. government with a fully staffed group through the Energy Department lending capital on behalf of the U.S. balance sheet for certain areas and contemplating doing this more. So we're in new territory that we've not been into, at least in my career. And we've had the oil companies facilitating the majority of all the actions on a multinational basis. Now we've got someone new communicating how things wish to be done.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm reaching for is does what is the U.S. grand strategy on this global energy? Is it and I'll just suggest something, and you tell me whether there's some grounds to this. Is the U.S., as you said, moving away from just supporting the major companies to moving more towards controlling the flow of energy globally? And is that looking forward to the next 10 years, 20 years, whatever, is that a way of ensuring that U.S. global power is still, is sustained, but this time not through the control of the production of energy, as in having alliances and dependencies and so on in the Gulf and elsewhere, but more an emphasis on controlling the flows, on controlling access, or controlling the trade of, or is that not, is that nothing new?
Yeah, I mean it's a great question. I mean, I think that it's fair to say we have someone who runs our country here that's very transactional, thinks more like a trader, thinks very transactional. So in controlling that, I think he's tried to put himself in a position, or us in a position, by taking on once again the merchant role of the United States. Now, they supporting a lot of the operations of the major oil companies in certain pockets within the U.S. for investment banking and capital structure, I think, are a good thing. The relationship as to how it flows internationally, I don't know that I can put my finger on what the logic is to that merchant area to control something or not. We've always had good relations in international markets. You've had issues over time, but you're once again, you're on new ground here. You're on new territory. If you go back and you think about in the years prior, like in the Reagan administration, one of the first things that Reagan did when he took office was he shut down the Russian expansion of their pipeline with Dresser Industries and said, I will not allow a U.S. company to continually with this sort of arrangement to build a pipeline to help someone else have production. We're looking at a similar situation, but we here are not as apprised a lot of times until after the fact of what some of the actions that have been taken or what the intent of some of those actions have been taken. From what I can tell you that I know here, and having spoken with some of the members of the administration last week, these actions to provide investment banking facilities or debt on the U.S. balance sheet in certain areas make a lot of sense. They are areas that are in need of capital but have been shut down by other major oil companies because they're not profitable. So you're going into an arena of opening up an asset that's not necessarily profitable, i.e., like I said a minute ago, uninvestable. Now, the other thing I would point out is it's not all about oil. I think the bigger issue is really, at least here, more of an issue with regards to electricity, power. We refer to it here as data centers. And as much as the demand for power is coming from everybody that has a cell phone, everybody that's got a cell phone that's got artificial intelligence in it, everybody that's running a desktop application or any application on a commercial or personal nature that's on AI, it's going to cost a lot of power. So we're suffering over here with what in the investment cycle, I guess, in parts of the big beautiful bill to build data centers, but the capacity and some of the restrictions that are lined up in order to facilitate proper execution have not been done. So instead of using a utility model to say, use the economics that are roughly not there for market base to grow data centers off of a capacity model on a grid in the United States, you're putting in private capital to facilitate a longer term investment, albeit it's not clearly defined how they're going to do it. So that's one of the bigger problems that I see right now in the industry, is that people are going to try and build data centers to hook up to the grid. That's one of the problems we have here in the state of Texas. You have it also in the Northeast. And a lot of people are starting to grow or go towards more of an investment cycle of building what we call behind the meter, which means you are running a standalone operation that is exclusive to supplying power to a facility, but it does not necessarily go to the grid. And now they're becoming kind of mini utilities, if you want to call it that. So this is, to me, on the power side, a very, very big problem. You've got a high demand, a very high growth, but can you reasonably execute some of these circumstances?
And that obviously touches on the prospects in the future. And then back to this issue of what the strategy is. I mean, some people have suggested that the method in Trump's madness is that the U.S. should control the Western Hemisphere, especially as far as the flows of energy. It's not, it's something that suggests that that's what happened in Venezuela. You're not taking over the country. You're just making sure that, Venezuelan government uh, uh, follows U.S. directions as to where this oil or this energy is going to go to. And the same thing with Greenland or Canada or whatever. So what this hypothesis is that this is really what's happening. First of all, have a secure be secure in the Western Hemisphere, and then and it's been happening. At least some people have seen it. See that it's happening. It's U.S. control of certain choke points on the global scene. Even Gibraltar, U.S. just signed an agreement with Morocco. All this big fuss about Hormuz, obviously, but then the Straits of Indonesia, which are controlled by the U.S. because it has close relationships with the surrounding countries. Even the whole business with Taiwan. It's all about the Straits of Taiwan, between Taiwan and Japan, and so on. So, this is the hypothesis. Let's say that this is the grand strategy of the United States. Does that resonate with you as something possible, true, or otherwise? What's your response on
Well,
that?
I would say this. Go back to the original, what you said in the original part of the question about the Western Hemisphere. I think that the view is that the Western Hemisphere contains a lot of oil. The Western Hemisphere also contains a lot of raw materials, which are rare earths, which has kind of been coined. We've traditionally referred to it as the metals market. I think it's now been coined rare earths. But because the rare earths, or the raw materials, if you will, are found over here in the Western Hemisphere, the real issue isn't about whether or not they can be found, refined, distributed, whatever, is that they're going more to the Far Eastern markets because they are controlling and have access. They are the supplier of finished metals for further processing of lithium and other things into a lot of requirements that get into renewable energy and other matters that are required by the world. So it's like kind of a very simple commodities. Someone is long, someone is short. I would argue that right now that there is a meeting going on overseas in China to probably address this, to see if some sort of arrangements can be made. That's the only logic that I would conclude from why this control of the Western Hemisphere is as it is that rare earths are controlled by someone else supplying the commodities to process to make something everybody in the world needs, versus the ability to make that in the United States. So, once again, our president, I don't think it's any secret, is a very closely guarded circle of influence that sometimes some of the stuff that has been pushed through leaves us in the industry to attempt to analyze his moves on the chessboard, so to speak. And it's very difficult for us to kind of make a conclusion reasonably because it doesn't look reasonable. It is a controlling element of commodities to try and influence a lot of supply chain management that I think is exclusive to his own set of economics.
It's just that the postulation is that that this is despite the fact that everybody is, not everybody, but some people are bemoaning the end of U.S. hegemony, global hegemony, and so on. This way is at least one way of ensuring that U.S. global hegemony, or whatever you want to call it, primacy, will be sustained for the next, 10, 20 years. It's answering the criticism that the U.S. administration is crazy and nobody can figure out what they're doing. Well, if you look at it from the point of view of what we just discussed, then it's not so crazy after all. Maybe.
I don't know. I mean, that's a little bit of a sticky wicket there. I would
Oh,
say
sure,
this though
sure.
too. I think that I would say this in the current market. I think most people's opinions that are involving energy firms, they're looking at the market right now as they've released their annual reports, they've released their views on the first quarter, they're executing against their capital plans and what's happening in the long term versus the short term. They're dealing with it the best they can to to accommodate supply and demand and consumer demand. I don't think there's any question about that. The upstream political influence of a little bit of the unknown for some things, we're
Yeah,
all having to deal with to kind of have a reasonable analysis that changes daily, but people are operating according to plan. I think that people will continue to operate according to plan as best they can do because that's all you got.
yeah.
Uh, it's hard to really try and grab and understand. Now, I mean, the fact that you say it makes more sense or does make sense by what the actions of looking at the supply and demand, someone who owns processed metals versus someone that owns the raw materials, then you start getting into trade agreements as well of influences of other host nations in those trade agreements. But that's also going to get into a lot of international political elements that I don't know that I want to really go there because I don't have that kind of information.
See, I mean, for us, it's a little bit, I mean, it's critical to look into that aspect to the extent that we can make sense of it, because the security of the Eastern Mediterranean and any security structures or architecture or this or that in the Middle East, in the Gulf, and so on. I mean, you've got to try, if you take the rational actor model and you expect these people to be rational, you're looking for a rational explanation. I mean, okay, you could say brush it all off and say, okay, this guy's a wacko, and you don't know what he's doing, and he doesn't know what he's doing. but I think that's not as simple as that, and it's too can't quickly write it off as his idiosyncratic, way of running things or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, and that's unfortunate. I would say that if you try and take
I'm
that out of the
reaching here.
equation, you
I'm
look at the
reaching here.
world.
Yeah, sorry.
If you look at the world and the energy it's in, like I said, oil companies, energy companies are doing what they need. I think you've made great strides in the energy business regionally, globally, more than I think people are really giving them credit for, and people are executing according. Give me a couple of examples. Right now, you have technology capabilities that have given people on power and batteries and storage that have been pushed into the right areas the ability to charge and recharge a unit and serve load on a grid much more than you've ever been able to do this before. It's happening in Europe, it's happening here in the States. It's allowing some of these catastrophic losses or catastrophic circumstances that exist for weather to be able to be maintained so that we have a normalcy when people need power or when people need when demand goes up. The other things that have happened, you recently, you want me to speak to your area over there in Europe, you've actually developed a very good procedural arrangement. There's a company that out of Europe actually has an exchange comparable to the New York Mercantile Exchange. They're called the ABAX Exchange, ABAXX. they were just named the newcomer of the year for of their abilities to be able to supply within Europe a pricing means of discovery that allows people to be, because you don't have a connected grid between your countries, you're kind of exclusive and micro to yourselves, but you have a mechanism that is certainly growing to allow for people to manage their pricing risk by using that exchange, which I think is very, very important, because that's how we started over here in the first place, back when we had merchants, really back into the 1990s before they deregulated our market. This is how we started. And that goes, so you're talking about something that happened, what, 36 years ago? And it's now the model that is ramped up over in Europe to allow for people to have price discovery for any areas within Europe or even into your Eastern Med market. It gives people a sense of pricing they can work with to do something. And I think that's what's very important, because these are the things that makes markets work.
Yeah.
Trying to get production on stream, trying to manage the pricing, trying to do things of that nature. It's also happening to where in Japan, you've had a lot more focus by a lot of efforts that have been put in place, where people have used the technology of modeling. You're now able to extract value for what is a forecasted electricity load much easier with some of the capacities. They've opened up the market. So, irrespective of what's going on from the political side in the Iranian situation, Venezuela, and some of the other bigger situations, there are a lot of things that have really come to the forefront by putting technology in the right place to do the right things. That I think has been overshadowed, unfortunately.
I think it's important what you say, but unfortunately for Cyprus is the odd man out in Europe, because we're so far removed from the European center of mass, let's say, that there's no. If there was a grid, we're not part of it, and we'd never be part of it because we're in the wrong place. So it becomes even more volatile there. So
Well, let me comment on that, if I may. Even as much as Cyprus is where it is, last week the conference I was at, they awarded the risk manager of the year with the gentleman who is part of the electrical group in Romania. Romania is not that similar, but yet a little different than yours. But yet they have a closed grid. But they were able to raise funds in a bond issue and effectively understand their portfolio economics much greater by being able to use a closed market, use a lot of these indices, and be able to have more of an upgraded view on what they were doing. I think a lot of for them was they were able to facilitate, lack of better word, communication between themselves of different agencies to work within to be able to do that. But it was a very, very impressive thing. And I think these are parts of other things. On Cyprus, you've got production that's coming on stream, you've got electrical grid, but you're closed into your grid. To me, an exchange or something like that might make sense, but I don't know that I have the reach into a lot of that like yourselves.
There was a little bit of thinking about that, because if you remember, there's an electrical interconnector that was being that's planned and was in the process of being implemented over the last few years, that would link Israel, Cyprus, and Greece, and it would be a two-way thing. Obviously, you could transfer power either way. But again, politics and other things, and it hasn't been completed, and I'm not sure if it is going to be completed. So, and especially in this climate, it's going to be hard. And one of the sticking points there is the EZs of Cyprus and Greece and Israel and so on. They're interrupted by the EZ of Turkey. So you need Turkish permission or cooperation to do this. And under the present circumstances, it doesn't seem like it's coming through. So, these are obviously micro problems, but for Cyprus, they're major, I mean,
No, I mean it's a very fair statement. I think that I would say this. I think that those being the political elements, all I can speak to is markets that have the ability to render pricing and to go through the mechanics of knowing where your demand, where your supply is, and how to have a mechanism of a financial offset in an exchange are very difficult to put out.
yeah,
They're very difficult because it's very foreign to a lot of people. And it just takes time to develop markets like that to have those financial offsets or otherwise. I mean, they're doing, and just to give you, and just for the record, I mean, the ABAX exchange I referred to, all the
right,
markets. We had a lot of Europeans last week at the conference, and we had some from Mexico, some from Romania, some from Czechoslovakia. They're all dealing with the same thing. They're having to kind of rein in or look at what their actual physical spot supply is because when I asked them, I said, "What's your biggest risk?" One of them responded, "Our own government." He says they could easily change the regulatory requirements and all our good work is gone. But he said we had to do something to get us moving to be able to find where we could control our economics, the borrowing bases, the supply chain management, all of the things associated with that. So, I wouldn't say that, you guys are exclusive in Cyprus. You're
no,
comparable to everybody. You just have those macro kind of micro views that are exclusive to
yeah.
you that have to be worked on like everybody else.
I mean, just to drive it home, I just found out, I don't know whether to what extent it's true, but that whereas the flows of energy are going from east to west in the Mediterranean, we are getting our energy from Greece, where it's going back. So it has to go to Greece and then come back to us. It's a little bit peculiar to say the least.
Well,
Uh,
that's always the interesting part of anything involving energy. When we were talking earlier about the Persian Gulf, and we visited about how much of Europe is being supplied by gasoline from the Gulf. I've always looked at it as in any market, the world is one big chemistry set and the world is one big global arbitrage. And the economics follow what makes sense physically and economically over those respective time periods. And backhauling, as we call it sometimes in the business, to be able to, instead of moving something on from supply to demand, we move demand to supply the energy because it makes sense economically for purposes of sometimes another capital program that's coming in. So it's like a band-aid, but
right.
you've got to be able to facilitate those kind of movements and capitalize on the extrinsic value that you can make. I mean, I've done that many times. I've had
Yeah.
cargoes in my career where I have traded them that what I were bringing from Europe, and instead of bringing them here to the United States, there'd be an issue. We turn that ship around and move it somewhere else for value. That's done every day. It's part of the business. It depends on the size grid that you're working off of, but that's just the nature of the economics that the energy affords people.
Right on that, because from my knowledge of some of the Cyprus supply to Cyprus was from the spot market. A lot of the Cyprus companies, at least, do that. How much has that been affected by what all the last events? I mean, from what I was following at some point, there were a lot of these tankers sort of roaming around, and if you got the right price, they divert to you, and that was a big chunk of the Cyprus energy supply. Is the spot market still working?
Yeah, good question. It all depends on how you in response to that. I'll say this: it depends on how you look at it. The trick here, I think, is to have if for a lot of people where it's working, the answer is yes. If you need supply, you can find it, and it's a price. It'll happen. Okay. There's always for every buyer, there's a seller on a physical component of where the transaction goes. I think that the problem people are having is they've sometimes have adopted hedge programs that we refer to that are we're managing, or from a risk perspective, the hedge effectiveness. So you would be, it's kind of like a correlation effect in math where you have what we call y equals mx plus b on a line from a graph that determines the slope. Your correlation effect of your physical and your financial hedge have to be managed, massaged. And when you get down to the spot market, if you have these spikes due to volatility from unknown areas related to the Gulf or something like that, you're moving the hedge part up. So a hedge effectiveness that's being measured is not as accurate because it distorts the economics. Like I said, physically you can get the product, but if you've hedged it and tried to lock in your economics with an alternate cash flow of a hedge, it can become very problematic because of this volatility. And it's forced a lot of people, to get out of that market and not do it anymore and go more to formula-based pricing to make sure that something of an index, and then again, it's just a matter of how that index has come out after you've had these economics established. So you've had obviously companies in the world for traders that have incurred huge losses. It's all over the news. But at the same time, I would argue that the fundamentals of the market maintain themselves. It's just required people to maybe sharpen their pencils just a little bit more and maintain a greater oversight, or perhaps alter the types of transactions that they're doing. That's probably
Would
in
you,
a nutshell.
would you say that the energy industry is resilient enough that, it's that what's happening now or the last few months and so on, and maybe into the future, that's not going to affect it in the long run? Or are we going to?
I hope that it doesn't. I think I'm personally getting very concerned when I'm looking at the level of inventories that are available into markets that require and supply more of the from a fossil fuels perspective, things that are available in the long term or in the next 90 to 120 days. You're requiring, there's been the ask over here in the United States for refineries that are making diesel, jet fuel, things of that nature, to defer some of their maintenance schedules, but you're in dangerous ground. You can't run an asset forever. And if you run it forever, eventually, if you don't maintenance it according to safety standards, just reasonable mechanical standards, you run something too hard, it breaks, and then you have to shut it down. And the devastation of a shutdown is different than a preventative maintenance program. But for the future, I am starting to look at this very carefully, that the supply chain and concerns are, you've got to fix this. You have to stop this area. We had some speakers last week that were in our program that were very specific to stating, it goes back to a kind of a decisive moment, is can the US and the Iranians and the Israelis all withstand something that's going to work or not work? And that goes very much into bigger geopolitical factors. But you've shut down a major port in the world. That's the problem.
Yeah.
And I think that is a very big risk factor in the world. I described it to somebody in Houston last week, where we're in the world's largest refining center. And I said, what would happen in the equivalent if someone put a fleet out there and decided that they're going to shut down that? No refined products are going to be coming and going. Now, granted, we're connected to pipelines that serve the United States, but if any attack were to come in and you had to rebuild it, it would take 10 years, and who's going to pay for that? I think that's what you're really faced with right now. And I can only comment as to how it looks to me. To comment on what the actual end game is, I read the news every morning, early, late, every day, to what exactly the chess pieces are moving there. And I'm not sure I can understand what chess moves are being made. I just don't see it. In the long term, you continually run equipment that is not maintenance, you run yourself into a problem of being able to meet your demand. At the same time, if you restrict supply inventories and pull them down, you're going more to an inflationary type of set of circumstances, which will cause people to pay more for a product, like you
Yeah.
mentioned a moment ago about the gas prices going up. I don't know what they are over there, but over here, our big machine within our regions of the United States are starting to show constraints of supply. That's why the prices are going up. That's just the way it works. So, my concern is this. Here's my other concern, and just to throw this back. My concern is because you are having these issues related to downstream supply of refined products or gasoline or jet fuel. You start getting yourselves into a situation where in the past history of the United States, we've not been real good with band-aiding a bigger economic situations, and we would issue a tax, or we would issue a tariff or something along those lines to service or work something associated with energy. I think when energy doesn't become a free market and the investment cycle doesn't support it, you cause yourself lots of problems. And anything that could come in as intervention or anything as legislation that would counteract this as a new tax or some sort of a new tariff or otherwise is very, very dangerous. And I've become very concerned about it.
Just again on the technical side, I mean, looking at the Gulf, I mean, obviously, if you're not shipping the oil out, you have to store it, and there's a limit how much you could store. At some point, you got to shut down production, be it refining, or even at the pump, or maybe at the pump first. I don't know. Isn't that a sort of a critical issue, because it takes, I would think that it takes a lot to restart production once it's.
Absolutely, without a doubt. That is a very good point, because when you shut down production, I think it gets a lot into engineering, but the best way to describe this is think of a hole in the ground that you've drilled, and when you're going down to produce the oil is coming out of different zones that has been geologically reviewed, has been reviewed by engineers, a very expensive process. And by nature of shutting down something from that, it's like when you turn it back on, will you get the same results? Probably not, because it all depends on the recovery of the hydrocarbon to the surface. You're operating a well that's, say, 10,000 feet in the ground off of different zones, but you alter that pressure, you may not get the same result for the production. And that's certainly what's on the table with a lot of fields over in the Gulf, because you're having to shut in production. Well, that's going to affect the ability to maintain any kind of production as well as any kind of maintenance. If anything, from a risk perspective, you're increasing your risk, because what you're doing is it's going to cost you more to bring that gas or that oil back on. It's a very complex process.
So is it a fair assessment that even if the hostilities would end today, you'd need another 6 months to a year to come back to normal, or would you even longer?
That's a good question. I think it would, under reasonable circumstances, for something that's been shut in, depends. You may be anywhere from 3 to 6 months being able to get that back on stream. I mean, it becomes part of the cycle of engineering to pipeline to be able to hook on new production and so forth. It's not I think that's the part about energy. I think that is sometimes misunderstood. If you start it, you can't start it back very easily. It's the same thing is true, I think, right now with a lot of the supply requirements globally, that people are starting to activate coal plants. A couple of years ago, everybody said coal's a dirty business. We need to be clean burning energy. Well, if you need to have the lights on and coal's your only game, and you're supply constrained, people are gonna do what is required. And so you've got different forces, I think, working in the market of what's the future, where if you shut in production, if you use other mechanisms, can you start them back, as well as what do you then go back on, where people have requirements, especially in Europe, where you've got a lot of requirements over there on your balance sheets of reporting your electricity usage or your climate change. You start altering your financial statements. So it's starting to become a bigger mess. I mean, I told somebody the other day, it's like you're cutting into a golf ball, and you start and the rubber bands start coming off. The deeper you come back, those rubber bands start coming off, and pretty soon, you're going to have to replace that golf ball. You can't even do anything with it. That's, I think, where you're at. It's becoming very much more complex.
Well, that's the. Thank you very much. I mean, thank you for answering all these questions. I hope I didn't tire you out.